Well, good morning. Have you heard the expression reality distortion field? An Apple employee in the back is nodding violently. That's where I first heard it. It was ascribed to Steve Jobs, who by force of personality, by salesmanship, was able to move people along into buying into things that didn't seem necessarily probable. And it's been used since then for other corporate leaders, for people in the press, for politicians. Uh, anyway, I was thinking about this passage in Mark, and I was thinking about how you and I are prone to walk around in our own reality distortion field, where maybe we're the only ones persuaded by our own read on what's going on around us. Sometimes we only hear what we want to hear. Sometimes we see circumstances in our own special way. And sometimes that's not shared by really anybody else around. Or sometimes we find a group and we all kind of look in the same way. And if you heard last week's sermon, you know that after Jesus set a man free from being demonized, the man said, "Please let me stay with you." And Jesus said, "No, go to the others in this region where you are and tell them what's been done for you." And you also know that the other people around that man, seeing the man freed and 2,000 newly demonized pigs running over a cliff, said, "Please go away, Jesus." Who had a clearer view of reality in this situation? It was the one who let Jesus get close. And that's what today's sermon is about. It's titled When Jesus is Near. And the key idea, I'd say, is that we see life most clearly when we're seeing it with Jesus nearby. We need his reality clarity field rather than the distortion one that we walk around with normally. And in the light that he sheds, we see what's important, we see what's possible, we also see what does not ultimately matter. And so this morning, my prayer is that you and I would desire to see life in line with reality the way Jesus defines it. And as we look today at this passage, it's the third in a set of miracles that Mark has packed together bang, bang, bang. And Mark wasn't just simply writing down everything as Jesus or as Peter told him. He's not writing down everything Peter remembered or knew. The Gospels aren't a history of Jesus, they are historical expressions of Jesus's story. The good news that God has intervened in our world and has done what is necessary to set broken things right. Things were broken, and he is in the process of mending them. Now, what is this new reality that Jesus and his word are proclaiming? Mark told us back in chapter 1, verse 15. This is Jesus speaking. He says, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe the good news." Well, he hasn't done much yet, but this is the declaration that he makes going into his ministry. And in the past two sections that we've looked at from Mark, Mark's been skillfully writing to demonstrate Jesus's mastery over every kind of power. So at the end of chapter 4, the power is nature. There's this terrible windstorm, there are terrible waves. The disciples fear imminent death, and they say, "Don't you care that we're going to die?" Experienced sailors on a sea they're familiar with, and they are terrorized. At the beginning of chapter 5, the power is no longer natural, it's supernatural. The demonized man is isolated, he's self harming, and he's scary to others. The man is being tormented by demons, and as Pastor Tim said last week, the demons too fear torment from Jesus. Now, today, in the second half of chapter 5, a man fears his daughter's imminent death. A woman has been tormented by isolation, doctors, and basically a slow, expensive death. So here's how we're going to look at this passage in three sections. The first is verses 21 through 24, when death draws near. And the second one is verses 25 through 34, when the bleeding won't stop. And finally, the third section is verses 35 through 43, when the king touches you. Now, when death draws near, when the bleeding won't stop, you and I need the touch of this king. Let's see what Mark says. Verse 21. When Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. Okay, this sounds familiar because that's when he left, there was a huge crowd. He's barely out of the boat again on this side. Here comes the crowd. On the other side of the sea, Jesus told the man to go tell others what the Lord had done for him. And Mark says the man went and told others how much Jesus had done for him. This man thinks Jesus is Lord. He went from being tormented by demons to being the best theologian on that side of the sea. Pretty short order. How about this side, the crowded side, the more Jewish side, the ones who have a familiarity with the God of the Bible? Verses 22 and 23. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, "My little daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she can get well and live." So on the other side of the sea, the people had begged Jesus to go. On this side, a synagogue leader, this isn't a rabbi, this is a person responsible for organizing services, for doing administrative things in the synagogue. He's somebody with some responsibility and some prestige, and he's begging Jesus to come and aid his dying daughter. Verse 24, so Jesus went with him, and a large crowd was following and pressing against him. It strikes me that big people love big crowds, but most of the time, people who have others plotting to kill them want to be seen at a distance by the crowd. This up close and personal thing is a little et tu brute for most leaders. So when the games are in action, Caesar's got his box and he's got soldiers, but everybody can see that he's there. Ooh, he's so cool. We can see him. And when the governor is in his chair of judgment, there's a bunch of stairs to get up to him, and there's soldiers in between because, you know, as important as the riffraff are, let's not let them get too close. But Jesus is a different kind of king. He makes contact possible. And the synagogue leader, Jairus, is not too dignified. He's not too aloof. He's not too good to ask Jesus to lay hands on his daughter to heal her. Why? I think one big reason is that death confronts unreality. Death has a really unique power to get our attention, can wake us up to the false sense of confidence in which we tend to live our daily lives. And the imminent death of his daughter punctures Jairus's normal reality distortion field. Everything's fine. I've got this under control. Suddenly, everything wasn't under control. Suddenly, he lacked power to solve the problem. And when a loved one is endangered or hurting, being close enough to touch Jesus is a good place to be. But before we get to Jairus' story, there's an interruption in the narrative. Mark is serving up a sandwich. He's got some bread, and all of a sudden he's inserting into it interruption, some kind of a filling. I have Oreo cookies, and if you want one on your way out, I'll make one available. The idea is you got two things with a different thing in the middle, right? Anybody like the outside cookie better than the inside filling? Okay, I'm actually with you people if I have to pick. Who prefers the filling? Okay, sugar freaks, ahoy. Really, I would argue that the cookie's best together, but I could be wrong about that. The point is, Mark is presenting us with an idea, a set of ideas that are coherent in some ways and distinct in other ways. It's a story interrupting a story. And we saw death drawing near in the first section. Now we see when the bleeding won't stop, verses 25 and 26. Now, a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Is this internal bleeding? Is it endometriosis? And even today, there are women who have what they describe as heavy menstrual bleeding for several years. I haven't heard about any that lasted 12 years, but to be honest, I'm not going around asking people. So Notice that Mark does nothing to diagnose the woman's ailment. He doesn't tell us what the illness is. What he describes is her suffering, her endurance of doctors who made things worse. Can I get a witness? And losing everything she had without seeing any corresponding improvement. So, where's her hope? Verses 27 and 28, having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing, for she said, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be made well. Now, the little girl has an advocate in her father, Jairus. He can't do anything to help her, apparently, but he has heard of a guy. This woman, on the other hand, is seemingly out of options. She has no advocate. Both the woman and the girl need more than a human. They need the God man, the Son of God. But simply touching Jesus's garment, doesn't that sound a little superstitious? Oh, his clothes will make me well. I don't think that's what's going through this woman's mind. She's going to Jesus, and I think she's thinking two things. The first is, I don't need to bug Jesus. And I wouldn't linger very long, but until the last few years, I hadn't been around a lot of people who told me, oh, I wouldn't want to bother God. What? I think what they're imagining is, God says, sorry, I'm on the phone. Like I'm talking to somebody who's righteous. Please hold. This is not what God is like. You know that? Here's what God is like. He's omnipotent. That means all powerful. He's omniscient. That means all knowing. He's omnipresent. That means he's everywhere all at once. He's immutable. That means his character is so perfect, he doesn't have to change. I have to learn from the many mistakes I make. God skipped that step. And he's infinite, which means forever past, forever present, forever future. He's there, he's good, he's got it. So when I say, oh, I wouldn't want to bother God with my concerns, what a low view of God I have. Who is he really? He's these things. God doesn't need you to pray to somebody else, and he's not going to treat you like he's a DMV worker and say, did you take a number? What's your number? Okay, that was the first thing, and much of that was an aside. I apologize. But the second thing is, this woman has apparently had an issue of blood for a dozen years, which means she's been ritually, ceremonially unclean for a dozen years, which means that anybody she's ever gotten near has shrunk away from her because the community knows who she is and what her problem is. And if you've got something coming out of your body, you're unclean. And that means you don't get to participate in the community's worship. And that means other people don't want to get the unclean on them. Her touch will make others unclean, is the way Leviticus works it out. And she's not only not wanting to bother him, she doesn't want to be seen as trying to make him unclean. But she believes that without touching him, she can still be healed by him, not by his clothes. Was she right? What does Mark say? Verse 29, instantly her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? It wasn't, who touched my clothes? That we don't see tone. I guarantee you it wasn't that. Have you ever had a long-term health issue that finally got resolved and suddenly you feel normal again, and normal is suddenly amazing? Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, I've talked to people, chronic pain from a knee, had a knee replacement. Once they healed, I'm alive again. Well, you were that way before. Yeah, well, I didn't appreciate it then because I had to bear all those years of pain. Once you've been in an abnormal state like that for long enough, one day with my back out, when I don't feel that pain anymore, oh, I am so happy. Being noticeable or being normal is noticeable in that situation. And it's It's an opportunity to appreciate instead of taking it for granted. And Mark doesn't explain how or why Jesus felt the power leave him, but Jesus also doesn't just shrug and say, okay, another satisfied customer. Hey, leave 5 stars on Yelp for me. He seeks instead to make a connection with her. This isn't a transaction where she gets what she needs and she gets to sneak off. He wants to know who she is. He wants her to know him. So he's initiating an interaction. He wants face to face with the person who reached out and touched him. What happens in verse 31 and 32? His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, you who touched me?" Now, Karen read it beautifully with a totally different tone of voice. I hear the disciples as being snarky, but he was looking around to see who had done this. Now, I think Mark is making clear that Jesus' own disciples have their own reality distortion field going on. They are motivated to believe some things about Jesus, they're motivated to believe some things about reality, and they are not yet seeing who Jesus actually is, despite their ongoing proximity to him. Verses 33 and 34. The woman with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Daughter, he said to her, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction. So there are all these people packed around Jesus, and one touches his clothes with faith. The disciples weren't wrong when they said, Jesus, you're completely surrounded by people. But this one was different. And so many people crowd around Jesus today wanting to get out of him what we want to get out of him. And a lot of people appropriate pieces of him. Some people have told me, oh, I love his teaching. I'm like, do you? Because when I read Jesus, it's often very difficult. The things he says about the use of money for a person living in this area are difficult. He speaks a lot about hell. I'm not super excited about that. Okay. Mike, I love his example. Okay, are you sure? Like, just in our study of Mark, he's a person who drew crowds of people, almost none of whom understood him. What we've seen so far is somebody who's been patronized by his family, antagonized by his religious community, and miscategorized by his disciples. Jesus' example is of suffering at the hands of the very people he came to serve. So, who is Jesus? He's the one with the power to heal, but the grace to seek the person who touched him. What does he speak to the one who comes to him? So go in peace. Like, I can for sure say that and it means nothing. How you doing? I don't care how you're doing. Yeah, go find your own peace. But when Jesus says it, he's bringing peace into the equation. The situation that needs peace, he can deliver it. And in John's gospel, Jesus says this more directly. I have told you these things, he tells his disciples, so that in me you may have peace. You will have suffering in this world. Be courageous. I have conquered the world. And what John has Jesus saying clearly in words, Mark has Jesus showing in this interaction that he brings peace even in suffering, and these miracles aren't going to set the whole broken world right just yet. They are evidence of Jesus' power and his ability to accomplish that at the appointed time. What is Jesus saying? It's not going to feel like peace unless you're in me. But I came to clarify reality for you and to dismantle the distortion that surrounds you. Okay, her faith in Jesus made this woman well, finally. His touch has made her not only healed, but clean at last. We don't get credit for our religious practice, our religious pedigree, pretending perfection. It's trusting God's involvement in our lives, even when we can't yet see it all clearly. Now, Jesus just finished saying in verse 34, daughter, your faith has saved you. She had touched him. The king is about to touch someone else. And this one crazy thing happens next. Verse 35, while he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? Oh, it was too late. What a shame. I spent this week thinking about receiving this news that Jairus received. Your daughter is dead. And I hoped thinking about it and saying this a few times would mean it wouldn't break me up. But it breaks me up, the idea of it. It's horrible. Why bother the teacher anymore? Now, this might just be an acknowledgement that despite what Miracle Max says in The Princess Bride, actual death is beyond mostly dead. It might be an accusation that Jesus didn't come quickly enough. I mean, this was an urgent case, and he stopped to have this chat with this lady who had an ongoing issue who could have waited an hour or two, right? Might be a sneer at the teacher. Oh, you're good with words, but nobody can help a corpse, okay? They don't come to life again. But Jesus's response isn't annoyed like mine just sounded. Here's what he says in verse 36 and 37. When Jesus overheard what was said, he told the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid, only believe." He did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James's brother. And just quick side note here, when Jesus shrinks the group of his people, not just to the 12, but to this set of three, crazy stuff is going to happen. It happens a couple more times in Mark. Have a look out for it when we get there. Now, if you've gotten news like Jairus just received, you know how he feels. And honestly, I think what's even worse is when people you care about are in a self-destructive cycle that you don't see any way out of. You despair of them ever seeing reality for what it is. But is there any obstacle to God reaching someone? What does he say? Don't be afraid, only believe. Well, believe in what? Tell me what to believe in so I can believe in it. Not what? Believe in whom? So let's finish Mark's story sandwich looking at what Jesus says and does, verses 38 and 39. They came to the leader's house, and he saw a commotion, people weeping, wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." Somebody is clearly in the wrong reality, right? Is it everyone else? Or is it Jesus who claims the child's not dead, but asleep? Now, this isn't the only place that Jesus describes a dead person as sleeping. John 11 through 15, Jesus tells his disciples, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm on my way to wake him up." Then the disciples, acute as ever, said to him, "Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will get well." Jesus, however, was speaking about his death, John says, but they thought he was speaking about natural sleep. So Jesus then told them plainly, "Lazarus has died. I'm glad for you that I wasn't there so that you may believe." But let's go to him. I'm glad for you that I wasn't there so you may believe. Okay, but because Jesus wasn't there, Lazarus died. That's apparently not a problem for Jesus, despite the commentary from the peanut gallery in Mark's account, verse 40. They laughed at him, but he put them all outside. He took the child's father, mother, and those who were with him and entered the place where the child was. All right, mom, dad, Jesus, three disciples, and a little girl in a room. These people laughed at him. Why? They're professional mourners. That's their job. They know dead. And in our experience, right, death has a 100% success rate. It's going to take all of us, hopefully not today, because our view of reality is distorted and we don't see who Jesus is. And so we mistrust him or we don't think about him at all. Verse 41, then he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." I think it's cool that Mark's writing to Gentiles like us who don't know Aramaic and then gives a translation. It's heartwarming in a way. And Jairus's original request when this all started was, "Come and lay your hands on my daughter," in verse 23. She was a living person then. Now she's dead, and what do we know about dead bodies? Also unclean. Jesus takes her by the hand. Now, sometimes Jesus touches people to heal them. In the woman's case today, she touches him to be healed. Sometimes he just says something. It's not a formula, it's a person. It's not a spell, it's his authority over everything. And Jesus imposes a different reality on the circumstances around him. And given his character, that is a very good thing indeed. Verses 42 and 43. Immediately, such a mark word, the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old. At this, they were utterly astounded. Then he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this and told them to give her something to eat. The text doesn't say the disciples expected this. But before we talk about how astounded everyone else was, let's look again at Mark's remarkable writing. All right. The girl was 12 years old. The 12-year-old daughter and the 12-year-old bleed overlap. It's interesting. So the girl has an advocate in her house, her father. She lives in a respectable person's house, her father. She has access to the synagogue. She's clearly loved by her father, who's willing to come to a man who has caused such a stir that there are rabbis plotting to kill him with the political leaders. Meanwhile, the bleeding woman has spent these same 12 years of life outcast, sick, increasingly destitute. And this terrible affliction was what drove her to reach out to Jesus, believing he could and would heal her. And maybe that sounds a little pat to you, a little convenient for my story. But I will tell you, I believe that with every fiber of my being, that connecting with Jesus, that's where every good thing in my life has come from. I have been sustained in terrible times. I've had a different kind of joy in good times because starting probably in my late 20s, I began to realize just how much of my hope was still lodged in the wrong things. We have a photo of three of us, and I'll be the younger man in the middle. A little less gray then. None, I think. On my left, your right, is my mom. Mom, starting with after my pregnancy, her pregnancy of me, uh, every pregnancy worsened her arthritis, which then continued to get worse the rest of her life. So as a young person, she began to have terrible arthritis, and then she had cancer. And on my right, your left, is my bride. And in addition to being allergic to virtually everything known to man, it turns out that she has buttery bones. Sorry, that's the surgeon's words, not mine. All three of us in this picture would have preferred reality to be different, but Jesus not only showed us his reality in these terrible circumstances, he gave us hope for today and forever. And every one of us faces this reality. We're not going to duck death's 100% success rate. Now, people were laughing at Jesus on his way in to see the girl, and those who experienced what Jesus did were utterly astounded. The people in the room were like Megamind, they're extremely boggled, extremely boggled. I asked my son if he knew what this quote was from, and he didn't. And I see a lot of blank faces. That's great. We'll move on. We'll move on to Greek word nerd. Okay, that'll be even more engaging. Okay, the word translated as utterly astounded is existomai. Say it with me, existomai. Bless you. Marvelously done. Okay, it's used, for example, in Mark chapter 2 when the dudes cut a hole in the ceiling and lower their friend down. He's paralyzed, so he can't get in, and Jesus heals him. The man gets up and walks. They're existomai. What are they? Fabulous. They're astounded. They're boggled. That same word in a little bit different place in the sentence is translated differently and still correctly in Mark 3 when Jesus's family want to restrain him. No mention if they had a chain. That's a joke pertaining to last week's passage. In Mark 3, the word is used to explain that Jesus's family thought he's out of his mind, existomai. Was Jesus the one with the distorted reality in that situation? No. Jesus's family thought he was crazy. The professional mourners thought his diagnosis of the little girl whose death they were mourning was laughable. Who sees reality most clearly? Maybe someone could admire Jesus's authority, his power, his teaching, his kindness, his selflessness, his service, his insight, his wisdom. That someone might not say, I want to be with him. They might not say, I want him to be in charge of my life and my eternity. They might say, I'm willing to put down anything he asks me to. They might not say, I'm willing to take on any tasks if he gives it to me. None of us could be willing to change the way we think about reality because he's the sane one. But putting actual reality in Jesus's hands is really where we were designed to be. And this isn't a one-time experience. We will spend the rest of our lives really being reoriented from reality distortion to Jesus's reality clarity. And I got Pastor Tim's permission to share a text he sent me half a week through sermon prep for his last sermon. And it says, well, I kind of feel like I'm starting over because I realized I wasn't making the point of the passage this week. I see it now. Now, this is me like every Friday, so, but it's not normally Tim then. And every week, those on the teaching team, we work to try to see our texts clearly, right? We seek to be faithful to the testimony of writers like Mark. And that's not just for pastors, it's not just for elders, it's not just for the teaching team. One of the greatest gifts any of us can receive is to gain clarity on what God's word says, because that helps us see Jesus's reality. All right, and as we close, I'd like to invite Malik and Raymond back up. And I know that people in the room are dealing with death in one way or another. And we are near to people who are, in some sense, bleeding, maybe not like the woman in today's passage, but we're scared. We're anxious for someone's physical or mental or emotional or spiritual health. And for some, the disease, the torment, the isolation, the death in this passage, it only registers a little because our lives and the lives of the people we care about feel much more present than this ancient story. But the sandwich of these two stories is a reminder. When you're focused on the problem, you're not looking at the solution. But when you're overwhelmed by the problem, Jesus is there. And we can fall at Jesus's feet if we're not protecting our dignity. We can reach out and encounter him when we realize that he really is our hope. And we can see death for what it is, something that God's power ultimately, he's proven, overcomes. So by way of a closing prayer today, would you bow with me? And I'm going to read a few verses from Psalm 36. Oh Lord, how priceless your faithful love is, God. People take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They are filled from the abundance of your house. You let them drink from your refreshing stream, for the wellspring of life is with you. By means of your light, we see light. Would you give us the light we need to see the way Jesus intended us to see? Amen.